Hi, everyone, and welcome back. If you're joining us again for the next event for our RevEx Festival, if you're just tuning in, welcome. Today's event is brought to you by the team at Modern Sales Pros. Hello, everyone. My name is Angelica. I'm one of the community event managers at MSP. And for those who are not familiar with Modern Sales Pros, we are the world's largest and highest quality community for those in sales management, sales leadership, sales revenue operation, and enablement, aka our modern sales pros. Our mission is to create an environment for our members to answer the toughest revenue questions out there. So if you're not a member yet, you'll be invited to join right after Summit. And our summit wouldn't have been made possible without our amazing sponsors that you see on the slide here. So big thanks to them for making RevEx Fest happen. And be sure to check out the sponsors tab located at the top of Goldcast to check out all their links and resources there. And while you're up there, don't forget to check out our full agenda where all of our panels and fireside chats are listed. If you missed yesterday's event, you'll be able to see all of our events there as well as our upcoming events for tomorrow. Now for the agenda for today's session, I'm going to quickly say some housekeeping notes, and then I'm going to pass it off to our awesome speakers today to do some introductions and dive right into the content. So first and foremost, this event is being recorded, so don't worry, you'll be able to access the key takeaways and recording post-event. Familiarize yourself with Goldcast. Please use the Q&A if you have a question or the chat. We love interaction throughout the whole thing and definitely make some new friends. It's really fun here. Now on to our session today, the data-driven modern SaaS investor. I'm going to pass it off to Pete Kazanji to introduce our awesome fireside chat today, and then I'll come back for key takeaways. Pete, after you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Angelica. Hello, Tomasz. How are you?
I'm doing great, Pete. Thanks for having me on the show.
Excellent. Yeah, well, I think actually one of your partners is on one of our panels as well, Erica. So so we got a big Redpoint party going on, and I actually think that Travis might be speaking as well, because there's an operating partner thing. So we got a whole Redpoint. Hopefully we don't have to pay anyone, because you guys are spending so much time for with us. But yeah, super pumped to talk with you today about SaaS investing, kind of how SaaS is changing. You've also invested in a number of kind of modern sales tech companies as well, kind of talk about that. But before we kind of get jamming here, I think some introductions are in order. For folks who don't know me, I'm Pete Kazanji. I'm one of the founders of Atrium. For folks that don't know, Atrium makes data-driven sales management software. It's software that helps organizations, so sales managers, leaders, and reps use metrics to improve the performance of their teams. Before I started Atrium, I started another software company called TalentBin that was acquired, recruiting software company that was acquired by Monster Worldwide in 2014. Subsequent to that, I wrote a book on startup sales called Founding Sales, and then also started Modern Sales Pros, which is why we're here today. So the nation's largest sales operations and leadership community, now 30,000 strong. So that's a little bit on me. Tomasz, maybe you can hip people, if they've been living under a rock, maybe they haven't read some of your writings, and we'll fix that later on. But maybe you can give folks a little bit of a rundown of what you spend your time on at Redpoint and what you did before that, et cetera.
Yeah, you bet. So I got my start in startups when I was 17, started a company in South America with my dad. And then I was an early employee at a company called Appian, which is now public, was at Google for about years. And been at Redpoint for about 14 and a half years, and focus a lot on early stage software. And obviously what's going on in the sales and the changing sales stack impacts every single software company, both for me as an investor investing in those businesses, but also all those companies actually operating and trying to grow.
Yeah, that's a really good point, right? Like the changing sales stack, because the changing sales stack, ought to drive more efficiency in go-to-market, and so that obviously changes the way that existing solutions can go to market, or moreover, it unlocks the ability to go to market for something that maybe previously didn't have an economically tenable path to market, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess you kind of get to work on both sides of those coins, right? Like thinking about how that helps these B2B companies that you invest in go to market in maybe a more efficient fashion, and then also potentially investing in them as well. Maybe you can kind of share some of the folks that you're invested in right now, where you're sitting on boards. I know that obviously I'm a huge fan of Chorus, which I think my Chorus instance might be in like the teens. I think I actually had my CSM look that up, right? Like the UID, because I was such an early customer
Wow,
of
incredible. That's
I
really
know
cool.
that's my flex. So maybe you can kind of, we'll talk about Chorus a little bit more here in a second, but maybe you can share some of the other companies that you're invested in.
Yeah, you bet. So I work with Monte Carlo, which is in the data analytics space, Dremio, also in data,
Mhm.
a bunch of great companies.
Oh, that's interesting, Monte Carlo, because I mean, obviously you were an investor in Looker, back in the
Yeah,
day,
Hex is
I
another
don't know, it
company
was like
that's
6 years.
super, yeah, it's growing really fast in data. My mind's spacing here. Let me just take a look. Preset, which is a
So
business analytics company. Um, I was on the board of Customer, which sold to Facebook earlier. So those are some of the businesses.
nice, that's cool. Yeah, and actually, I didn't realize that about Dremio. They're actually they're an Atrium customer, so
Incredible.
we enjoy working with them. Awesome. So obviously, all B2B all the time here. You were an investor in Chorus. Obviously, it was a good outcome to Zoom Info. Everybody knows Chorus, everybody knows Zoom Info, right? Like two great tastes to taste great together. Maybe you can kind of share a little bit about what made you so excited about Chorus and kind of its place in the market.
Yeah, I saw this movie Her. I don't know if you remember that movie Her with Will
Yeah.
Smith. And like the whole thing is about speech to text and how he interacts with the computer. And like, set the romance aside for a second. I thought the human computer interaction was really cool. Like the fact that um, computers were so sophisticated that they could understand human speech. And
Mhm.
so then I started exploring like dictation, looked at like drag and nuance, and then started playing around with that. I'm super impressed. That's actually what's inside. Like if you use Apple dictation today, there's a
Yeah.
dragon underneath. And then went searching for applications for this kind of technology and met a bunch of companies. Got really excited about Chorus and led the Series A there. Um, and there wasn't the space there, and now you've got Chorus and Gong, and clearly it's a tool that every company needs in
Yeah.
order to understand what's going on in the sales process. And it's awesome for like training and onboarding and pure analysis to see what's happening inside of your funnel, what the keywords are, and all those things.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, we I just for fun, we use Chorus and Gong over here at
Oh,
Atrium because like obviously why wouldn't you? We but it's always hysterical. What the reason why we do this is because Atrium ingests data from both, like Atrium ingests data from like lots of different systems, and obviously conversation intelligence is like a pretty, as you point out, it's like at this point it's table stakes, right? Like you gotta, like if you're not doing call recording, like what the hell is wrong with you? Right. But it's always like really funny, like our AEs will be on a call with prospects and they're like, why are there two note takers in here? And then they get to do like a little bit of a flex because like, oh well, like make sure that we have like a good data corpus, for ourselves to use to pipe it into our own Atrium instance, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, it's totally over, like at this point it's like table stakes, right? Like it's just like, oh, like what's wrong with you? I think that's an interesting thing, is like it's very difficult to like create those categories out of whole cloth. It's definitely like pushing a rock uphill when you are like working with organizations. But there's obviously like lots of great upside there when you're working with organizations who are creating new categories versus that, like ones who are kind of like a better mousetrap, like a better way of doing this thing that already exists. Like, you might consider Looker in that case. Like Looker was just like way easier to use than, than Tableau or some of the like kind of like, Wave 2.5 or whatever BI solutions. What are some of the guidances that you do with your portfolio companies who are seeking to create these new categories?
Yeah, it's one of the most important questions I think when you're looking at a business is a company going to create a market, or is it in a replacement market like red ocean, blue
Yep.
ocean, greenfield, brownfield, whatever color
Yep.
you want to use. The strategies are really different, right? I think if you are creating a category, you have to. I think Gainsight was probably the first that did this really well in a very
Yep.
overt way. They became the champion of a particular person within the organization, right? They became
Exactly.
the champion for the customer success person, and they
Yeah.
created an event. And that event was never really sort of a sales event. It was an event to make those people feel like validated and give them the tools to be
Mhm.
successful and connect them with each other. And I think the other thing that's so that's really important is sort of empowering that
Yeah.
champion, equipping that champion, and
Yeah.
to solidify their own position within the company. And then once that happens, you want to be able to create a product that doesn't necessarily have to be PLG, but can be very quickly adopted by that
Yeah.
persona. And
Because they're
George,
not going to stick their neck out necessarily. Like it's got to be quick, right? Versus, yeah.
yeah, so time to value's got to be really fast. George, who is the COO at Salesforce and at Twilio, had this awesome thing that he said once, which was the goal of all software is to sell a report. That's how you justify the spend on sales. And so, thinking through, hey, what is that report, right? And for Salesforce,
Mhm.
it was pipeline analysis. I think for like Gong and Chorus, it's like health of the pipeline. What's going on in my pipeline at a very deep
Mhm.
level?
Yep.
And so if you're creating a category, you've got to think about like, okay, what is that end report that I'm producing? And then I think that the last part is, I think it's really important to have a management team that is comfortable like being on stage. And I mean that both in like
Yeah.
a very physical sense, but also
Yeah.
yeah.
We call it being the dancing bear. It's actually my job.
Yeah.
Is yeah, you gotta be. I mean, like Nick Mehta at Gainsight's a great example of this, right? Like the chief cheerleader for sure, 100%.
Yeah, so you have to kind of be the face of that movement, and
Hmm.
you have to. I was once talking to a very sophisticated marketer, and she said, um, "Marketing team is sort of the amplifier of what the founding team of the message of the founding team. It's not necessarily that the marketing team comes up with this new creative." And so, it's
Yeah.
super important that that comes from the founding team. And then the last thing I'll say is, you need a go-to-market strategy that sort of resembles the game of Risk. And what I mean by that is you want to paint as much of the map your color as quickly as possible, because
Hmm.
as those accounts expand, you want to grow with them. And so that's really important. And so typically you often see those companies burning, say, a bit more capital on
Mm.
on an annual basis or on a
Yeah,
quarterly
they're
basis.
they're 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 less they're yeah they're not necessarily grumpy about lower sales efficiency because like they just gotta it's they're grabbing land.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. It's just about massive growth. It's like you need to kind of create the wave yourself, and that means moving a lot of water.
Yeah. I mean, as long as there's like good stickiness there, I think one of the things that I've seen in at least like we work with a bunch at this point. We have nearly 300 customers here at Atrium. I see a lot of different like organizations and kind of their metrics and things that you would think would be like stickier end up like not being as sticky as you'd think, which is like, kind of like interesting. Like there's like relative levels of lock-in. And so yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying. So actually Nick Mehta is another fireside chat
Oh,
for
nice.
yeah, and he was, don't worry, you guys are on message together, because he talks about like the community piece of it as well. And I actually cite him and the work that Gainsight did as being very inspirational as to what I've done and our team has done with Modern Sales Pros, where what you're focused on is like the superset problems of that person, right? Like that human. Like in our case, we champion the sales manager, the SDR manager, the sales leader, and help, because like we exist to help them use metrics and data to better manage biometric, which is something that historically, like, no shade on like Looker or Tableau or whatever, like those are for analysts, right? Like those are
Yeah.
analytical tools that are horizontal analytic solutions. And so and so what we're in the business of is championing the ability of this business user, this like non-analytical user, to be able to do that. And so, but what we do is we then wrap all around like all of the problems that they have, right? Like how to do one-on-ones, like how to do QBRs, how to do how to do performance plans, like how to have tough conversations, all these sort of like ancillary things are really just like focused on like their day-to-day job. And I think that's a really important thing, because otherwise, because like that budgetary line item does not exist otherwise. Right? You're instantiating that from zero there. And I think Gainsight's a great example of that. And then I think the other thing I might note there too is you just have to be like, I think this is probably like a corollary to the thing about being comfortable being on stage, is you just have to be comfortable with the fact that it will probably take a long time. And I think Gainsight's a great example of this. Actually, Gainsight's another Atrium customer, luckily. We love, man, their sales team is like absolutely fantastic and has a huge diaspora, and everyone there is so nice. It's like amazing. And I think this is related to this. We're like, things take a lot longer than you would think. And so you just have to be comfortable just like slogging it out, which I think is maybe why Gainsight has such an amazing cohesive organizational culture. Because if you didn't, you'd have like people churning out and like you'd never be able to make that journey. And then the other thing too is you just have to be comfortable just like repeating your message until you're blue in the face and like your tongue falls out. And like rolls around on the ground.
Internally and externally, right?
Internally, yes, that's a great point. Yeah, you definitely, that is interesting. Can you say more about that? Because I think that's underappreciated. People think like marketing is out to the market versus internal.
Yeah, so a brand is the sum total of all the interactions the customer has with an organization. And if you think about it, like a CEO might, I don't know how many meetings the CEO is going to take, but if you think about
1 million.
A 1,000-person company is going to have 1,000 times more meetings than just that CEO, right? Something
exactly
like that. And so what you really want to be able to do as a leader is mobilize your entire company to say exactly the same thing over and over and over again. One of the things I learned at Google was you need somewhere between 7 to 15 ad impressions before you start to remember a brand and make an association. So going back to your point of just kind of repeating what a business is about or like what their goals are, you need to say it 7 times, right? And so
at least,
if you want to reach an audience of 100,000 people, okay, that's 700,000 impressions. 700,000 times you're going to have to say the same thing.
So kind of changing gears a little bit here, what are some of the biggest like changes that you've been observing in how your portfolio companies go to market? The like how's that changed over the last like decade or so?
10 years ago, I think most of it was driven by outside sales. There was a lot of field sales. Then now we've been seeing, there's the inside sales movement and ultimately kind of culminating in PLG. And so now you've got the product organization that's responsible for generating leads, the marketing organization that's responsible for generating leads, and the sales org. And different companies have sort of different allocations across those lead generation sources. The role of content marketing, I think, is absolutely enormous, and sort of came to complement what's happening with Google, like SEO and SEM and the ad networks there. And then I think maybe the last thing that's really happened is the sizes of the contracts that people close through inside sales has gone up absolutely enormously. Like to think that, it used to be like you could close a 10 or 20K deal over the phone, but now you're starting to see like 500K deals close over the phone. And COVID was a really big accelerant for that.
Yeah, for sure. I think the thing about like PLG is and I think you invest in developer tools. I mean, I guess like data stack would be considered that. Historically, one of the ways that like where PLG kind of comes from, the earliest version of that was like open source software, right? Yes. Where the software is like it is the piece of content. It is like, you have the community edition, or I worked at VMware back in the day. So one of the jokes we used to say at VMware was that because VMware workstations piracy countermeasures were so weak, it was like one of the best kind of pieces of marketing that that VMware had, was the fact that like people could pirate the hell out of like VMware workstation. And so just like ended up kind of like sprinkling VMware VDK VMs like all over the market. But now it's making its way to business tools, right? And obviously things like, I mean, we're on Zoom right now. Things like things like that, or like Slack or Notion or whatever. But I think the interesting thing with that is like typically like those are pretty simplistic use cases, like pretty easy to adopt, etc. Do you see that extending to more complicated use cases? Because the good news is like they're simplistic, like they can a lot of different people within an organization can use them. Oftentimes they're like lower average monthly spend, right? Because like, you can command 10, 20, $30 per human who's using it per month, but that's not like 200 or 300 or 400 or 500 or what have you. How do you do you see that kind of making its way towards those higher value use cases as well?
I do. I see a lot of enterprise companies trying to push into PLG, and I think the realization that like PLG is not just a go-to-market motion; it actually requires a pretty significant product investment to get to
Totally.
where you can land with a particular user. That user is going to get enough value that they're going to convince the person next to them to start using it. Those two are then going to convince the team, and then at that point, the account executive gets involved and is offering SOC 2 compliance or whatever, integration into the security suite or any kinds of reports that the execs might want. And then at that next point, it's sort of ELA. And so if you've got like a heavy infrastructure project, like you said, open source is kind of the first example of this. But like, if you're selling like 150K or 300K deals, you got to really figure out like, okay, I'm sort of using an AE plus a sales engineer in order to close and configure and show value, and I'm accustomed to going through a proof of concept model where like if stuff goes wrong, I can use my relationship and my sales
Intervene.
skills, and
Yeah.
like smooth it over and be like, just give me a couple hours
Yeah.
to get it fixed. Whereas like in a PLG motion, you're kind of on a high wire act where if it doesn't work, somebody's going to go out of that funnel, right? And so you only really have one shot, and your conversion rates can be 4 to 15%. So the other thing to really consider if you're looking at like a truly PLG is, top quartile is like 4% unassisted conversion rate. You need a total number of buyers that's like in the millions to be able to
Pretty big.
that.
Yeah. We have like a modified motion in that regard. We're like sales assisted. So it's more like Datadog-y in that regard, where, everybody who, buys Atrium, we sell on customer data. So it takes like, 3 minutes to turn on an Atrium account. Like you just, through a read-only connection to your Salesforce instance, but then it's like assisted by the sales rep, right? So it's kind of like, it's like Datadog in that regard, insofar as there's like a bounded trial, et cetera, et cetera. Our pricing on a per seat basis is a little bit higher, but I think what it kind of speaks to is, again, that kind of like that category creation situation where seeing is believing for a lot of these situations, like for a lot of these categories. Like you can wave your hands, and if you're not a replacement situation, painting that story with like slides or videos or whatever is probably going to be a little bit tougher. Like you can still get it done, but the win rates are going to suffer, which is problematic. And I think that's where, now the good news is that there's actually like more and more, there's things that are kind of in between, and like this is actually an emerging part of the sales stack, is like demo automation software, like companies like Reprise or Turiel or like Nevadic, or there's a number of others as well that kind of help bridge that in between. Have you seen that impacting the go-to-market of the companies that you work with?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you're exactly right. Like all these motions are going to kind of change, and I think they're going to converge where all these companies actually have some form of like product, some form of marketing, and some form of sales driven lead generation. And I've been curious about like what does that mean for like the future of customer success? I think one of the things like if you read Frank Slootman's book, he's the CEO of Snowflake. He actually got rid of the customer success team inside of Snowflake. And for more technical sales, like a lot of companies are sort of replacing them with technical account managers instead, who aren't so much gold on revenue, but they're gold on like customer sat. I think that's sort of another interesting advance, particularly in the more technical side. And then like at the very, very bottom, like I think it was Adobe who kind of pioneered the concept of the CSAM, the customer support account manager. Kind of all gold on customer expansion.
Yeah, I think the I haven't read what is the book? Amp It Up or Amp
It
Up?
Yeah, oh my gosh, it's so intense.
I haven't read it, but I think the funny thing about it is it's like, it's a pretty provocative statement to be like, oh yeah, like, I got rid of customer success. But then if you like actually read what happened there, it's just that like like the job to be done of like successing the customer got like rolled back into the commercial piece, like the AM, like it's almost like a semantic like change. Like it's like, oh, I got rid of customer success. It's like, no, you just made like the success behavior did not leave. It just became, it just like got rolled back. It like rolled into the human who is responsible for, and I think that probably makes a lot of sense in an environment like that is usage based, right? Where you're trying to drive more, like Snowflake is obviously usage based. And so I think that could make a lot of sense there. If you have a situation where it's not usage based and instead it's like contract based, where it's like, an annual, annual contracts or like, multi-year contracts or what have you, oftentimes organizations really find a lot of success with the customer success, like the customer success staff being solely responsible for usage and adoption and what have you, and it being important that those people have that they're not viewed as having an economic incentive to drive that, whereas they can be viewed as a impartial, right, kind of like consultant there. So anyway, just would worry that people would take something that is like potentially like a, obviously a very kind of like provocative like line in the sand of like, oh yeah, just blow up your customer success team.
No,
And I know you're not advocating for it, but it's just like it's a very kind of like famous anecdote from that book. And I think that I think this is an interesting question here, which is how is SaaS changing more broadly? So we're talking about the go-to-market side of things. What are some of the kind of like patterns that you're seeing in how SaaS is changing?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a really big push towards PLG, I think, and that's sort of reinforced by what's happening in the public markets, where you've seen a 70% correction in the forward multiple. So that, now the most important correlate to a company's value is its net income margin, its profitability, as opposed to its revenue growth. And so I think if you're in the late stages of a startup or the early stages of a newly public company, you're really thinking about efficiency. And so that's sort of like doubling down on the PLG motion. I think we're sort of in a place where many of the largest horizontal categories have many players, and you're starting to see more and more competition. So people are kind of dividing up those markets more than they have been in the past.
Mm-hmm. What would be examples of that?
Well, look at the PLG CRM category, right? Like that's like a subsegment of the CRM category, and how many players sort of exist there, right? That's sort of one example. And I think you look at the number of customers, there was Customer with a K, which we were investors in. Then there's a whole ecosystem of customer support companies that are built exclusively on Shopify or predominantly on Shopify. And so now instead of a Zendesk that spans the entire customer support ecosystem, you have people going after just fractions of an ecosystem. Is
that reflective of is that reflective of the fact that like the markets for SaaS are just way larger than what people initially anticipated?
Yeah, I think that's exactly that. I mean, another great example is like the database. The database. This is an infrastructure, but it's a $100 billion a year business. And so, like, if you're looking at like a time series database, for example, like a graph database, those are, I don't know, 5 to 10% of the market. 10 years ago, when the market was like 20 billion, it's not a public company. But today, if you can capture 5% in revenue of a $100 billion market, you're a $20 billion market cap company, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that's exactly what's, and all these markets are way bigger than people thought. Like you can see, like Datadog and many of the highest growing SaaS companies are now growing 60% at scale. From Bill.com, another one, way longer than most people thought. And so it makes sense to go after these individual segments. I think the other thing that's really happened is like the prevalence of vertical SaaS. Viva sort of pioneered that model. That's a really big deal. And then I think that, big discontinuity that's coming are these like large language models, right? Like DALL-E and GPT-3. That's a really big leap, right? You could imagine, like, when was the last publicly traded company to go public? So when was the last IPO in marketing? Maybe it's Braze, but before that, there weren't that many companies.
Mm-hmm.
But you could imagine the next generation Marketo where you're typing in like, I don't know, 10 to 20 words, and DALL-E's then synthesizing 100 different creatives to run ads, and GPT-3 is spitting out 100 blog posts, and you put $10 million to spend behind it. And then you've got a machine learning algorithm figuring out, okay, like, I'm going to iterate an A/B test and not fully optimize, and these 3 campaigns are going to run for a quarter. And like, that's a completely new way of doing B2B marketing, right? You can even imagine white papers being machine generated.
Yeah, I've been kind of like playing around with some of the GPT-3 stuff. I know that Craft Ventures is actually one of our investors, and they're also investors in Copy AI, which I think is like, or at least based on last time I think I saw on Twitter, growing kind of like a weed right now, because it turns out like writing is hard for a lot of folks. How do you see, like, have you made any investments in kind of like verticalized applications of these large language models? Because the historical way of doing this was to have like your own model, right? Like there was like trained painstakingly on, if you could get the data corpus and what have you. But now the metaphor that I kind of use for this is kind of like standing on the shoulders of giants, right? Because you have these like large language models, and then you can jump ahead kind of the same way, like in, Ruby on Rails, or like, what have, like, rather than having to build a bunch of stuff from scratch, like you're already pretty far along. Have you guys done any investing in that just yet?
Not yet. We're definitely looking at it. I think it's a huge discontinuity. I think you're right. Like, it used to be that every company needed its bespoke machine learning model, and now the models are so large that they basically can serve any number of use cases. And the other thing that's sort of happening is you got like a base level of GPT-3, and then on top of that, like companies like Copy.ai are sort of building their own machine learning models in order to get the outputs from the big models to be better, to be superior, higher quality. And that's just going to continue, right? So it's a big deal. I mean, I think both on the image generation side, we were investors in a company that's doing speech synthesis that then sold to another portfolio company, and they do like you can modify like a blog post, and if you say something too many ahs or too many ums, you can just delete the text, and then the video will synthesize, and then the voice will synthesize. So I guess we have invested in a business that does that, and that's cool. That's neat. But I think we're first inning of those kinds of the applications of those kinds of technologies. Very, very first days.
Yeah, I wonder to what extent like there are use cases that historically resisted machine learning application that, for whatever reason, that now will be unlocked. Like there's a company called Cresta that does like real-time coaching for call center, like service staff, right? Like someone says like, I want to churn, and it hears it, and like like flies in like a card to like help the service rep be able to like handle that very quickly. They're another Atrium customer, and what I remember talking with the founder, probably like 5 years ago or so, and he was talking about like automating salespeople and so on and so forth. And I was like, I don't know, like, a mid-market sale is like it's a pretty thorny decision tree, right? Like there's a lot going on there versus a much shallower decision tree, which is like, hey, I want to churn, right? Like someone calling in a Comcast and be like, I want to cancel, right? Like, okay, cool. There's like very much like, there's like a handful of like dyads, right? Of like, here's this thing that needs to happen as a result of that. But now, with these large language models, at least maybe portions of what an account executive, like a mid-market account executive would spend their time doing potentially can be AI, AI implemented. Like, an example that might be, assisted writing for like a follow-up email,
Totally. Well,
as an example.
on the customer support example, I mean, if you're running a $2 billion call center and you can save, 5%, you're talking about $100 million, right? So that's a lot of money. And the previous generation was like the standard like support vector models and classification models. You could get to like 20% deflection. So 20% of the inbound calls or emails could be handled by a computer. But imagine you get that to 50% using like generative speech or
Mhm.
any next generation NLP. Like it's a big deal. It's big business.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too is like a lot of times people talk about like replacement or automating away things. I kind of think about it more as like symbiotic. And to kind of give an example there, there's a company that we here at Atrium are customers of. It's called Second Nature AI, and what it does is I grew up playing baseball. I like to think about it as kind of like a batting cage for salespeople or success people, where essentially you're having interactions with a with a counterparty, like an avatar, that like behaves, that plays out certain scenarios. Like it might be a discovery call, or it might be like, an objection. Like you give it the set of objections that it's supposed to ask, and then you give it the correct answers. And of course it then just like tests you on it. But also it like on its end, it's like parsing that in order to understand whether or not you're like the rep in question like actually hit the ball, right? Like in the batting cage. And the traditional mechanism by which you would have to do that would be, a manager spending lots and lots and lots of time with a rep, or a sales enablement person spending lots and lots and lots of time with a rep. And so now you can have what essentially is a digital counterparty evaluating your execution and making you better at that. And so like I think that would be a good example of kind of the symbiosis of these large language models. They use GPT-3, I think, under the covers there, but kind of helping with that. And like similarly, you can imagine a situation where an account executive, like, I guess it's kind of like, GitHub Copilot, right? Where it's like it helps you write out like the boring shit, whereas and then the human is like spends their time thinking through like the very thorny human, like political, like emotional stuff, and like working on that. But if you could like, I'm just thinking about this with respect to my AEs, right? Like if instead of a follow-up email taking like 15 minutes, instead it takes 5 minutes, because a bunch of it is just like pre-written for you, or like runtime written for you, that would probably be pretty compelling.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the history of robotics, right? Like the first robot that most people had in their home was a washing machine,
Sure.
washer, right? And so, like, what we're talking about now is in knowledge work, there are all these things that are sort of we can be routinized, can be made routines, like the follow-up email or whatever it is. And that's going to allow you to focus on the 10% of work that's going to drive the most leverage for you.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of leverage, I mean, I know that especially the investing market's changing a little bit now, because of the raising interest, like raising interest rates and what have you. But one of the things that I don't think people appreciate as much as they should is that like investing is very much like sales, and it's like you essentially are like an outside sales rep, right? Especially when you're trying to get into competitive deals and what have you. So, how do you view your role as kind of being akin to a seller? And I obviously you do a bunch of great content, generation as well. How has that kind of helped you as win deals or get top of funnel and what have you?
Yeah, so any person who works in finance, whenever somebody says they work in finance, they're a market maker, which means that they're selling to two different people.
Mhm.
And so my job, like I sell once to startups and I say, hey, you should really work with us. And I sell also to Red Points investors, right? And I say, you should really invest in us. And that's, a part of the job that I didn't really understand until several years that I was doing it, where like the closest thing to a role is venture capital role is a field salesperson, because you might invest in like 2, 3, 4 companies a year. How you find those companies, how you convince them that you're the right person. Everybody has their own style, and everybody kind of does it their own way, and so that's very much. And then they're big transactions, right? Typically very large transactions with long sales cycles. So it lends itself quite a bit to that analogy, I think. Same on the fundraising side. And so there are different styles, right? Like you can have like an inside rep, and there are VCs who are very comfortable kind of closing deals from their offices. There are people who really like to travel. So there's a nice analogy there. There are people who do it solo. There are people who do it with SEs or
SEs. What would be the SE equivalent?
well, like an SE equivalent, you could do it with like an operating partner, right? Like
I
somebody
see.
like Travis, right? Like somebody who really understands how to build and scale a company. You can go along and sell one to. And so there are a bunch of, and then VCs now have platforms which are we call ours founder success. It's all about like not necessarily expanding the customer relationship, but making sure that the customer is successful, which our success is their success, or vice versa. So there are a lot of analogies, and then you've got VCs now developing pretty significant marketing arms, right?
Yeah.
In order to drive awareness and brand building and lead generation, all those things.
You're so like I know you blog, so that's like one of your kind of, or like you, Tomasz, blogs. You have a newsletter too, if I recall correctly, right?
Yeah, they're the same thing. I mean, you can get it by email. You can get the blog.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. So is that like your primary marketing vector there?
Yeah, my goal is to be in as many people's inboxes 2 or 3 times a week as possible.
2 or 3 times a week? Is it really that frequent?
Mm-hmm.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
How do you like find that many things to write on?
GPT-3. No,
So then why isn't it 5 days a week?
Yeah, exactly right. I think you have this incredible opportunity where I get to talk to brilliant people all day long about how they're changing the world, and then I learn a lot from them, and so I just try to share it.
Yeah, like kind of right. It's kind of like the LLM thing. Like I was talking to a company that that does like assisted writing stuff, and I was talking with the founder, and we were talking about how it's like it's like a creative counterparty, right? So it's not like, hey, do this for me. It's more like, I'm going to take a shot, you're going to iterate it, I'm going to take what your iteration was, I'm going to iterate it again, and like and keep going until you're like, all right, cool. So it's almost kind of like a writer's room, but instead like your counterparty is a machine, as opposed to it being other writers. And it sounds like in this case you have that going on with like a positive externality of your job is you get to interact with like all these founders who kind of like make you think about new stuff or what have you, and that probably like gets you going, and you kind of like see patterns. I wonder what the large language model version of that is, having smart conversations with a robot to kind of get your brain juices going.
Yeah, like a Wikipedia based robot. That'd be interesting.
Yeah, there you go. Right, it would be like a cocktail party conversation training robot. You wrote a book too, didn't you?
I did, yeah. I co-wrote a book with Frank Bien, who is the CEO of Looker, called Winning with Data. And it was just like a collection of interviews with people who were doing really cool things with new modern data architectures, and sort of the problems that they were facing and how they solved them.
I think that's actually an underappreciated kind of marketing mechanism. As somebody who wrote a book on, like, I didn't write founding sales because it was like part of Atrium's marketing strategy. It was just because didn't really exist, right? The like a handbook for $0 to $5 million in ARR didn't really exist for like founder selling. But in retrospect, it's been extremely helpful. not least because like we can send copies of my book to people, and it's like not very expensive. Because turns out like paper is not very expensive. It's I guess it's the first version of software, right? Like very low marginal cost, right?
Yeah, it's an incredible form of direct marketing. I mean, we used it at Looker where we would go into a city, we would send the book to like 30 or 40 people, and then once you've given them something, there's sort of like a social construct where it's like, oh yeah, I guess I should go to the event, and so that worked. I'm sure you've done something similar.
Yeah, totally. Well, we're out of time, Tomasz. Thank you very much for taking the time to chat with us today and kind of like share your perspectives on, sales tech, kind of how go-to-market is changing over time, the kind of change of the SaaS market, and what have you. We're going to go ahead and bring Angelica back up here to tell everybody about the next set of events that are happening at the Revenue Excellence Summit here. But Tomasz, thank you very much. I appreciate you taking the time.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me, Pete.
Okay, take care. Bye.
Hey everyone, thank you Tom and Pete for that wonderful fireside chat session, and thank you everyone for attending. I'm here to announce the next event coming right up, the female CRO and her playbook to success in an industry of men. So we'll see you there.